23 years of certification work is basically paper pusher junk, and frankly, it's the anchor dragging this company to the bottom. The new CFO said that to my face on a Tuesday morning Zoom call, sipping cold brew through a metal straw, 4 days before he fired me. The man was 33 years old, had never stamped a single engineering drawing in his life, and he was talking about documentation that kept 400 regional jets legal to carry passengers over American soil. That was 7 weeks ago. This morning, that same company wired $3.4 million into my account and signed a contract that makes me, for all practical purposes, their landlord. Let me back up and tell you how a guy from Wichita ended up owning the keys to the building he got thrown out of. My name's Mitch Garrity. I'm 56 years old, and until this spring I was Director of Certification Engineering at Caldera Aerostructures, a company in Wichita, Kansas that's been building fuel system components and ice protection hardware for regional aircraft since 1987. If you've flown on a 50-seat jet anywhere east of the Rockies in the last 15 years, there's a decent chance parts I certified were keeping ice off your wings at 31,000 feet. I joined Caldera in 2002, back when the whole engineering department fit in one room that smelled like burnt coffee and hydraulic fluid, and the founder, an old Cessna man named Gus Templeman, still ate lunch at the same folding table as the machinists. The day the new CFO fired me, I had $4,118 in checking, a daughter in her junior year at Vanderbilt with $62,000 a year in tuition and housing, and my mother in a memory care facility in Darby that runs $5,900 a month. Every month, rain or shine. Sopra was going to cost me $2,100 a month just to keep my blood pressure medication covered. Sit with those numbers for a second. I did. All weekend. But here's the thing the new CFO didn't know when he gave his little speech about right-sizing legacy overhead. The company didn't own its certification backbone. I did. Not in spirit. On paper, signed, witnessed, and filed. And the distance between what he assumed and what was actually written down was about to cost him his career. Two things made that true, and I need you to understand both, because together they were a loaded gun sitting in a filing cabinet for 22 years. First thing, I'm what the FAA calls a DOR, a Designated Engineering Representative. That's a federal designation issued to me personally, not to Caldera. When a part needs engineering approval to be legal on an aircraft, my signature is what makes it real in the eyes of the federal government. You cannot transfer that. You cannot inherit it. You can't buy it in an acquisition. It took me 11 years of documented experience and a Kansas City FAA office full of skeptical inspectors to earn it, and it lives with me in my briefcase wherever I go. Second thing, back in 2003, I built a piece of software on my own time, nights and weekends in my garage. Because the commercial tools back then couldn't handle the thermal analysis our ice protection systems needed. My brother-in-law at the time was a contracts attorney, and he flat refused to let me just hand it over. He set me up with an LLC, Garrity Engineering Methods, and instead of giving Caldera the software, the LLC licensed it to them. Gus signed the license agreement at that folding table with a turkey sandwich in his other hand. Clause 9, paragraph 2. In plain English, if Caldera ever terminated my employment without 90 days written notice, the license terminated 30 days later, automatically no court required. Gus laughed when he signed it. Said, "Mitch, the day this company fires you is the day I've already been dead 10 years. He wasn't wrong as it turned out. He passed in 2019. That clause sat in 2019. That clause sat in a drawer for 22 years, quiet as a church, waiting for somebody arrogant enough to wake it up. Somebody arrived in February. The board had been courting a private equity firm out of Dallas, Granite Peak Capital, about a buyout north of $900 million. Part of the courtship was installing what they called transformation leadership. What we got was a 33-year-old CFO with a Kellogg MBA, a Patagonia vest in 3 colors, and an email signature that said, Builder, Operator, Believer with an actual mountain emoji at the end. A grown man putting mountain emojis in business correspondence with the Federal Aviation Administration in copy. His first week, he stood up at the all-hands in our hangar and gave a talk about velocity. Used the word friction 11 times. I counted because counting kept me from saying something out loud. He said Caldera had world-class products trapped inside last-century processes, and that his mandate was to find every dollar of trapped value before the deal closed. Then he smiled this orthodontist commercial smile and said, Some of you are going to love this ride, and some of you are going to discover you prefer the past. I remember thinking, son, the past is where all our airworthiness approvals live. You might want to be nicer to it. He started small, the way they always do. He renamed the document control department the knowledge velocity team. He cut my conformity review budget by 40% because, quote, double-checking is a culture of distrust. He brought in a software subscription, $8,000 a month, that was supposed to auto-generate compliance reports using AI, and the first report it produced cited a federal regulation that was repealed in 2009. I flagged it in writing. He replied, appreciate the legacy perspective with a thumbs-up emoji. Then he started taking my younger engineers out for one-on-one coffees, called it unlocking their potential. What he was actually doing was mining them for how my certification system worked, while quietly teaching them that the gray-haired guy down the hall was the reason their stock options weren't worth anything yet. I'd see them come back from those coffees, looking shaken, mumbling things like, he asked why a part needs 3 signatures when Amazon ships a package with 0. These were good kids. Kids I'd trained to understand that in our business, the paperwork isn't bureaucracy. The paperwork is the only proof that the metal flying over a school playground is the same metal we tested in the lab. You lose that thread of proof, and you don't have an aerospace company anymore. You have a very expensive scrapyard with a felony exposure problem. My calendar started going quiet. Meetings about my own certification programs happened without me. The Granite Peak diligence team toured my test lab while I was at the dentist, which I only found out because one of them left a Granite Peak pen on my desk like a calling card. The CFO started a Slack channel called Project Daylight and forgot to add me, then posted screenshots in it of my conformity archive, those rows of gray binders going back to the Clinton administration, with the caption, found the anchor. 40 terabytes of trapped value, 0 searchability. Time to digitize and dump. Digitize and dump. Federal certification records. I want you to hold on to that phrase because it comes back later wearing a government letterhead. I didn't argue, I documented. Every email, every Slack screenshot a friend forwarded me, every meeting I was scrubbed from with dates and timestamps into a folder on my personal drive. And then I did the most important thing I've ever done with a highlighter. I pulled my copy of the 2003 license agreement out of my fire safe, ran yellow ink across Clause 9 Paragraph 2, scanned it, and sent it to my attorney, an old golf buddy named Sal who's been doing contract law in Sedgwick County for 30 years. Subject line, if they walk me out without notice, does this still have teeth? His reply landed in 11 minutes. It said, teeth, claws, and a tail. Say the word. The breaking point came in April. During the diligence presentation to Granite Peak's technical advisors, the CFO presented my entire ICE protection certification methodology, my test matrices, my analysis approach, the substantiation structure I'd spent 2 decades refining after we nearly lost a launch customer in 2007, all of it rebranded as the Caldera Rapid Compliance Engine, which he claimed his transformation team had developed in, quote, a focused 90-day sprint. One of the advisors asked a question about similarity analysis for the new wing variant. The CFO blinked twice and said he'd lube in the technical function offline. The technical function was me. I was in the building, eating a gas station sandwich at my desk, specifically not invited. That's when I knew the date was already picked. You don't erase a man from his own work unless you're planning to erase the man. The call came on a Friday at 4:12 in the afternoon, because of course it did. There's some unwritten executive scripture that says bad news digests better when it's served cold heading into a weekend. He was at his standing desk with a ring light, and he had that look people get when they've rehearsed being humble in the mirror. Mitch, he said, like we were about to discuss fantasy football, I've been doing some deep thinking about organizational topology. Then came 6 straight minutes of business school vocabulary, value streams, deprecating analog dependencies, sunsetting tribal knowledge. The man had swallowed a LinkedIn feed and was reciting it back to me. Then he delivered the sentence that ended his career, though only one of us knew it at the time. He said, your role is eliminated effective today, but honestly, take it as a compliment. We're institutionalizing your knowledge. Everything in those files and systems is company property now anyway, right? And he chuckled. This thin, clicking little laugh, like a seatbelt that won't latch. No HR in the call, no severance packet, no notice letter, 90 days of required written notice, and I got 11 minutes on a Friday and a follow-up Slack message that said, Grateful for your chapter here, big things ahead for both of us. Rocket ship emoji. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say a single quotable word. I logged off, closed the laptop like I was folding the Sunday paper, walked to the kitchen, and poured 2 fingers of Buffalo Trace. Then I opened the laptop one more time and wrote the only email that mattered, to Sal. Subject: terminated without notice, 4:12 p.m. today, Clause 9 is live. Body: start the 30-day license clock, draft the cease and desist on the methodology they're showing investors, and put together an invoice. Let's make sure they learn what reading costs when you skip it. Attachments: the agreement, my termination Slack message, and 22 years of license payment records proving exactly whose software had been running their compliance shop since George W. Bush's first term. I had sent and slept 9 hours for the first time since February. Sal had everything drafted by Sunday night. We sat at his kitchen table with his wife's banana bread and built it like a watch. The cease and desist was 3 pages, no adjectives, no anger, just facts with exhibits. Authorship records on the software going back to 2003. License invoices paid by Caldera, monthly, for 260-some consecutive months, each one an acknowledgement in writing that they did not own it. My DR designation paperwork from the FAA, with the part of the federal regulation that says it's personal to me, underlined once, gently, the way you underline something for a child. Then the invoice. Sal wanted a round number. I said no. Round numbers look like anger. Specific numbers look like accounting. We calculated it the boring way. Unpaid notice period. Unauthorized continued use of licensed software. After my batch was killed. Unauthorized commercial representation of my methodology to investors as their own work product. And projected DR engagement fees at market rate. It came to $2,614,380.17. At the bottom I added one line in my own words. Caldera may retain provisional access to affected software and records for 30 days pending negotiation. Continued use beyond that date may constitute violations reportable to the FAA under each production approvals. Sal looked at it, leaned back, and asked the only strategic question left. You want this in their inbox Monday at 9 or Friday at 4:12, just to rhyme? Monday, I said. Let them choke on it sober. Monday, 9:05 a.m. Central. The letter went out. At 11:40 a.m., the CFO posted in Project Daylight, heads up team, expect some legal noise from a recently transitioned employee. This is standard friction. Legal has it handled. Eyes on the prize. I know the exact wording because 3 different engineers screenshotted it to me within the hour. He thought it was a bluff. He genuinely believed I was a bitter old guy waving paper. He never understood that his entire Rabbit compliance engine, the centerpiece of a $900 million pitch, was my garage software wearing a new haircut, and that every airworthiness approval flowing through that building had been flowing through my federal signature. By 2 o'clock, Sal called. No response. Good, I told him. Let the clock run. It runs the same speed whether they believe in it or not. The unraveling started on a Wednesday, 8 days later, and I want to be precise about this part because the timeline is the whole story. Tuesday night, his team executed the digitize and dump. They scanned a portion of the conformity archive with an outsourced service, declared victory in Slack, and sent 22 years of original certification records, signed originals, raw test data sheets, the wet ink chain of custody, to a shredding vendor, to save $1,100 a month in storage. Wednesday at 9:30 a.m., an FAA inspector out of the Wichita office showed up for what was supposed to be a routine surveillance audit. Routine, except the new lean process had been shipping ice protection valves for 3 weeks, with auto-generated conformity reports from the $8,000 a month AI tool, and the inspector pulled one and found it referenced test data that no longer physically existed. He asked to see the original records. There was a silence in that room, I'm told, that you could have certified as a structural material. By Friday, Caldera received a letter every aerospace manufacturer has nightmares about. Production approval under review. Shipments of affected part numbers suspended pending records reconstruction. Their largest customer, the airframer that puts our hardware on basically every regional jet rolling out of its line, stopped accepting deliveries that same afternoon and triggered the late delivery penalty clause in their supply agreement. $85,000 a day, compounding like a parking meter from hell. And the records reconstruction the FAA wanted? The only legally recognized engineering authority who could resubstantiate those approvals was a DER with direct knowledge of the original certification basis. There are 4 people in Kansas with that designation in this specialty. 3 of them are me, if you measure by relevant history. The 4th retired to Scottsdale in 2021 and won't answer his phone during golf season. The Granite Peak deal went on life support by the following Tuesday. I know because their diligence they'd emailed the board a question that someone blind copied to me, probably one of the Gray Binder's last remaining friends in that building. The email asked, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, please clarify ownership of the core compliance software, the status of FAA production approval, and any outstanding claims from former engineering personnel prior to Thursday's investment committee. 3 questions. I was the answer to all 3. The CFO's tone changed overnight. The rocket ship emojis stopped. His camera started staying off in meetings. He told the engineering team the FAA situation was a paperwork formality, and one of my old kids, a sharp young woman named Marisol who I'd hired straight out of Wichita State, stood up in that meeting and asked him, if it's a formality, why is the loading dock full and nobody's allowed to ship anything off it? He said that question wasn't constructive. She told me later it was the most constructive question she ever asked because watching him fail to answer it was her whole education in 1 minute. 2 weeks and 1 day after my termination, the board held an emergency session. The CFO wasn't presenting. By that evening, his face was off the leadership page of the website. No announcement, no farewell, just digital erasure, and the press release that followed used the phrase leadership realignment to support regulatory excellence, which is corporate for our transformation guy drove the bus into a federal lake and we are still in the bus. The call I'd been waiting for came on a Sunday evening while I was grilling pork chops and listening to the Royals lose. It was the board chair himself, a Granite Peak operating partner who'd flown into Wichita commercial, which for a private equity man is practically sackcloth and ashes. He didn't waste my time, I'll give him that. Mitch, he said, the first thing you're owed is an apology. We trusted a presentation instead of a person, and it's cost this company more than the difference between those 2 things should ever cost. Then he paused and said, we need you back, not in your old chair. Chief Engineering Authority, final word on anything that touches certification. I let the girl hiss for a while, long enough for him to hear it. Then I said, if I come back, here's the shape of it, and there's no other shape. My company keeps full ownership of the software and the methodology forever. No buyout discussions, ever. Caldera licenses it month to month, and I can pull that license with 30 days notice if I ever again watch this company treat compliance like decoration. My dear services bill at $1,200 an hour. And before I read a single document, there's a $75,000 retainer wired up front. I don't work on faith anymore. I tried that for 23 years and got 11 minutes on a Friday. There was a long quiet on the line. Then he said, that's a highly unusual structure. I said, so is shredding federal records to save $1,100 a month. He laughed one short, honest bark and said, fair point. Send the paper. They signed everything, but first they paid the bill, and by then the bill had grown because clocks run whether you believe in them or not. Sal's final invoice included the original damages, the continued unauthorized use during their handled by legal phase, the penalty exposure I'd be digging them out of, and a line item Sal labeled with a completely straight face, Executive Education Services, $3,418,19,706.52. They wired it without a counteroffer. It landed on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee out of the same chipped Kansas Jayhawks mug I've had since my daughter was in middle school, reading a trade article about Caldera's valuation getting marked down 14%. And I'll tell you what I tell everybody who asks about the money. The money mattered. I won't insult you by pretending tuition pays itself. But the money was the receipt, not the meal. The meal was watching an entire boardroom learn, in public, with the federal government grading the exam, the difference between owning a company and understanding one. Walking back through those doors was a strange thing. Nobody clapped. Engineers don't clap, and I'd have walked right back out if they had. The machinist nodded. Somebody had rescued about a third of the gray binders from the shredding vendor's staging pallet, an act of quiet mutiny I never officially heard about, and they were stacked outside my old office like sandbags after a flood. The new interim CFO, a careful, decent numbers guy promoted from controller, tried to schedule a recurring Monday sync with me. I declined and told him my calendar accepts 2 kinds of meetings, billable and emergencies, and that if he ever couldn't tell which one he had, that confusion was billable too. The first months were ugly, honest work. Reconstructing certification records is like rebuilding a courthouse after a fire. The building's the easy part. It's the proof that takes the time. I spent 12-hour days resubstantiating approvals, sitting across from FAA inspectors who were professionally unamused, walking them through the original engineering logic from my own retained copies. Because here's the part of the story I held back. The part only Marisol knows because she's the one who earned the answer. She stayed late one night during the reconstruction, looked at my personal archive, decades of duplicate records, organized, indexed, fireproofed in a storage unit off Highway 54 that I've been paying for out of pocket since 2009, and she asked me straight out, "You knew? You knew somebody would torch the record someday, didn't you?" I told her the truth. I didn't know who, and I didn't know when. But I'd spent 23 years watching what happens to institutional memory when the people holding it get optimized, and a DR is allowed, encouraged even, to retain copies of his substantiating data. So I retained, every year, every project, my own complete set. When their shredder ate the originals, the only intact spine of this company's airworthiness history was sitting in a 10 by 10 storage unit between somebody's jet ski and a dead piano. She was quiet for a second and then asked the question that told me she's going to be better at this job than I ever was. She said, "But what if the gap had hurt somebody? What if a bad valve had actually flown?" It couldn't have, I told her, and this is the part nobody at the top ever understood. The acceptance test rigs in our lab run firmware, I wrote. There's a configuration lock buried in it. The day they cut my badge, every rig in that building silently reverted to the last certified test configuration and refused to pass anything that didn't meet it. Their lean process could fake the paperwork, but it could not make my test stands lie. The shipments the FAA suspended were paperwork failures, not hardware failures, because the hardware had a guardian they didn't know about, and if it had ever gone further than paper, I'd have picked up the phone to the FAA myself that same day. Politics, lawsuits, and grocery money be damned. There are things you let collapse to teach a lesson, and there are things you never let collapse at all. And knowing the difference is the actual job. By fall, the production approval was fully reinstated. By Christmas, the airframer not only resumed acceptance but expanded the contract, $320 million over 6 years, and their procurement letters specifically cited Caldera's, quote, demonstrated depth of certification expertise and records integrity. I framed that letter, not for me. I hung it in the hallway outside the lab at eye level, right where a Granite Peak pen was once left on my desk. The deal with Granite Peak eventually closed, by the way, at a lower number, with my licensing agreement and consulting terms written directly into the purchase documents as, and I quote to filing, a non-transferable critical dependency. During the transition meetings, their incoming chief engineer, a serious woman who'd actually bent metal for a living before she ever touched a slide deck, asked me how long it would take to replace my systems and methods with something modern. I told her about 23 years, assuming she could find somebody willing to spend their nights in a garage and their weekends in an FAA office, and that the modern thing about my system was that it worked. She nodded slowly and said, "I'm starting to understand the hourly rate. Smartest thing anybody from Dallas said all year." The young engineers changed too, and honestly, that's the part I'd keep if I had to give the rest back. They stopped asking why everything takes so long and started asking why each step exists, which sounds like the same question and is actually the opposite question. I run a session every Thursday now, no slides, where we take a real incident, sometimes ours, and walk through the chain of small, reasonable shortcuts that led to it. I tell them the paperwork is a love letter to a stranger, some passenger in seat 14C, you will never meet, promising her the wing stays clean. You don't shred love letters to save $1,100 a month. My daughter graduated from Vanderbilt in May. At dinner afterward, she asked me if I ever regretted not just taking one of the cushy offers that come at me now, the startups that want a graybeard for the pitch deck. I told her I like being able to say no, and that no is the one word an employee rents but an owner holds the deed to. She rolled her eyes the way she's done since she was 9. But she also asked me to look over her first job offer letter, and we sat there with a yellow highlighter, the two of us, going line by line. Best billable hour I ever gave away free. Last month, an email surfaced to my inbox like a fish going belly up. From him, the old CFO. Subject line, reconnecting and exploring synergies. He's advising early-stage companies now on, his words, operational excellence in regulated industries, and he wondered if I'd be open to collaborating on AI-driven modernization of legacy compliance frameworks. I read it twice. Part of me wanted to reply with a single scanned page. Clause 9. Paragraph 2. No comment. Part of me wanted to forward it to Sal with popcorn emojis, just to fight emoji with emoji one time in my life. I deleted it. Some men learn, the rest just relocate and reload the same gun with fancier bullets. People call this a revenge story, and I let them, because it gets clicks at the coffee shop. But here's what it actually is. It's a consequences story. He didn't fall because I pushed him. He fell because he spent 90 days sawing at the branch he was standing on while calling the saw innovation. And the only thing I did was decline to catch him. I won, if that's the word, because I'd spent 2 decades building systems, legal, technical, and paper, designed to survive exactly one thing: a confident man who doesn't read. So now I'm back at the folding table, metaphorically speaking, still signing my name where the federal government can see it, still writing the boring kind of records that nobody appreciates until the shredder shows up, still reviewing every contract that crosses my desk like it's a pre-flight checklist, because it is one. And the next time some young builder-operator-believer looks at a wall of gray binders and sees an anchor, I hope somebody in the room tells him what an anchor is actually for. It's the thing that keeps you off the rocks when the weather turns. You're welcome to cut it loose. Just don't be surprised who you have to call and what the hourly rate is when you finally figure out where the rocks are. I'll answer. I'm the guy who kept the copies. I keep thinking about that turkey sandwich. Gus Templeman signing a license agreement at a folding table in 2003, one hand on the paper, one hand on his lunch, not knowing he was planting a seed that wouldn't sprout for 22 years. That's the thing about causes and effects in this life. They don't run on your schedule. Every careful record I filed, every dollar I quietly paid for that storage unit off Highway 54, every weekend I spent earning a federal signature, nobody could take from me. None of it paid off the day I did it. It paid off all at once, on a Friday at 4:12 p.m., when a man who never planted anything tried to harvest my field. And the same law worked on him. The CFO didn't fall because I pushed him. He fell because every shortcut he took was a small debt. And debts like that always come due with interest. He shredded original records to save $1,100 a month, and it cost his company a 9-figure markdown and cost him his name on the website. You can delay a consequence. You can rebrand it, put an emoji on it, call it friction. You cannot cancel it. The bill always finds the address. What saved me wasn't luck, and I want to be honest about what it actually was. Part of it was simply refusing to cut corners when nobody was watching. Keeping the test rigs honest, keeping my copies clean, picking up the phone to the FAA myself if real hardware had ever been at risk. Lawsuits be damned. A man's word to a stranger in seat 14C has to be worth more than his grudge. Part of it was judgment. The slow kind. The kind Marisol is building now. Knowing the difference between what's old and what's proven. Reading every contract like a pre-flight checklist. Understanding why a rule exists before you delete it. And part of it was just plain stubbornness. 11 years to earn that designation. 23 years of boring, faithful documentation. 16 years paying for a storage unit everyone would have called paranoid. Endurance doesn't look like anything while you're doing it. It looks like everything the day it's tested. Those 3 things hold each other up, I've learned. Smarts without character is just a cleverer way to crash. That was him. Good intentions without grit fold the first time a boardroom says no. And all the persistence in the world is wasted if you're persisting at the wrong thing. You need all 3, the way an aircraft needs lift, thrust, and a pilot who tells the truth on the inspection form. My daughter asked me once what the real win was. It wasn't the wire transfer, I told her. It was sitting with her and a yellow highlighter, going through her first job offer line by line, passing the seed along. Plant honestly, learn patiently. Hold on longer than the storm. The harvest keeps its own calendar, but it always comes.